Hi there, my name is Melanie Zurba, and I'm an assistant professor with the School for Resource and Environmental Studies. I have a joint appointment with the College of Sustainability as well here at Dalhousie University. And my lab is the Community-Engaged CoLab, and you can check out the projects related to my lab if this presentation is interesting to you and you want to see how some examples of research connect to this approach. You can go to my website, which is community-engagedcolab.ca. So this presentation is about community partnered research and boundary work. So boundary work is an approach that I use throughout my projects quite a bit, if not always, and it's an ethical approach to working with communities. So I'll describe that as we go on. But to begin, just talking about why this development of approaches for working with communities and why it's so important. So community-based approaches are becoming increasingly called for in many disciplines. I'm seeing, requests for collaboration with folks who really didn't have to think too much about community engagement in the past, natural scientists, for example, but increasingly within universities and other research institutes, there's a focus on research that serves communities, that enhances equity, and that really creates stronger connections between community goals and values and research. So, I mentioned equity, but there's also an increasing understanding about the connection between universities and how research should be with, for, and by communities rather than on or about communities. And the on and about paradigm was really about, studying communities and them being quite separate from the research process, including the research design. So the approach that I'm going to talk about today really tries to change that quite dramatically. There's an increasing realization too that the knowledge co-production can provide important insights for management, as well as insights for the development of health interventions, many other outputs from research, and so actually co-producing knowledge between researchers and community members can lead to more significant outcomes that are effective in their contexts. Knowledge co-production, of course, isn't easy, and that could be, that is an entirely other lecture, but it's an important part of this discussion. And of course, we're living in a time of reckoning and considerations to reconciliation and righting the wrongdoings of the past, in particular with Indigenous communities. The calls to action for truth and reconciliation outline many suggestions relating to research, and so do other important reports, such as the 60 Scoop report, missing and murdered Indigenous women's reports as well. So these are important considerations to keep in mind when thinking about working with communities in research. So it's important to talk about what a community is. I won't dwell upon this for too long, but it's often taken for granted. We think of communities in a very general, kind of colloquial kind of way, but it's important to understand how communities are bounded, how there are certain characteristics or parameters, diversity that needs to be considered. So there are different scholars that have contributed to defining different principles for communities. McQueen and colleagues in their paper talk about communities as having a locus, so a physical location, a place. This is often, intuitively what people think of when they think of communities. When I ask my class, what community do you belong to? Often they'll be like Halifax or something like that. But of course, communities can be defined in a lot of different ways. Sharing of perspectives, common interests. I work with youth climate activists. This would really fit with this element, as well as the third, which is action. So joint action or activities. So working towards particular goals together. Ties, social ties or relationships. So that can be even familial, things relating to, different kinds of social dynamics, right? There's so many, you really could unpack that forever. And then, of course, diversity. So differences in age, belonging to racialized groups, income, behavior, and so on. So those are just examples. And we can also think of communities as communities of practice. So this is something, that relates to a lot of different sectors or particular groups that are brought together by those common interests. And so Wegner and colleagues defined three components of a community of practice, and so that they have a domain, which is their concern or a set of problems or a passion about a topic, and their practice refers to the action and knowledge generated by the group. And of course, the community is the interpersonal relationships that are built through engaging in the practice and learning together. And so this is important for understanding how communities are brought together, how they're formed, and how they address issues of common concern. And it's relevant to the rest of this discussion because it really explains how researchers and people from, outside of academia come together to work as communities of practice, and how that is really a foundational kind of concept and a way of thinking about that relationship. When you think about the research that actually happens, that is community engaged. Okay, so communities in research and boundary work. So now we're starting to get towards this approach that's called boundary work. So community-based research can be geared towards understanding community values and aspirations in certain communities, as I mentioned. In research, we're often working with key informants and organizations and look at people's roles as they relate to the area of research. One thing that I think vexes people when they think about community engaged work is, okay, who am I talking to? Can I just walk into any community and grab someone off the street and they're my community partner and can speak for the community? And of course, we know that's not true. That's why communities have organizations or leaders or elders or particular people that are the right people to engage with when working around a particular topic. So that's important to keep in mind at the start of this type of work. And so the boundary work approach aims to provide principles for work with communities. It's kind of a practical, I like to think of it as a practical framework or set of guidelines that people can work with for developing their relationships with community partners. And I find it's a nice framework for anybody at their academic stage of career, whether you're a student or whether you're a full professor. Sometimes it's good to have milestones that make sense in this relationship that is community engaged work. So boundary work comes out of a very different kind of history where it was about communicating to different groups across boundaries. So boundaries as being conceptual, like epistemological, social, political, but not impermeable. So values or, aspirations or knowledge can be transcended through these boundaries, but the boundaries do exist. And so with, in the definition, it's those acts and structures that create, maintain, and break down boundaries. That's how boundary work is understood. I would say in most of the boundary work that I do, it's about breaking down boundaries, but I've also seen really good reason for why boundaries should be maintained. And especially when you think about sensitive knowledge systems, traditional knowledge, knowledge that hasn't always been treated well or respected, there are reasons to maintain those structures, to protect those knowledge systems. So, a research design could certainly facilitate that as well. Although I would argue that, most research funders aren't really in favor of funding research that is to protect knowledge. Rather, they prefer it to be about sharing. And that's why you see more of the boundary work that is more about transcending and sharing. So connected to boundary work is this concept of boundary objects, that boundary objects can be identified or created through the research. So it can be either. So this is rooted in participatory action research. And boundary objects are defined as items that are collaboratively produced between researchers and communities towards communicating messages across those social and political boundaries or epistemological boundaries, basically whatever the boundary is. This definition focuses on producing, but as I mentioned, boundary objects are sometimes simply identified through the research process. So I'll give a few examples of that as we go along. But essentially, they're powerful tools for knowledge translation and research dissemination, and they provide a site for cooperation, debate, evaluation, review, and accountability. So basically, anything that can provide a site for these things to happen can be a boundary object. So boundary objects can be very simply a report that is designed, co-produced, and it provides that pathway. The research process itself can be a boundary object, as long as it is functioning in that way that it provides a site for cooperation, debate, evaluation, review, and accountability. I work with the arts quite a bit. I really have been very privileged to see the power of arts-based approaches for communicating community values and aspirations. This painting behind me was the first boundary object to come out of a research project that involved myself. That was my master's work. And so, this example is much like another example that I'm going to share with you next in this presentation. So I thought this was a good one to share because I think it makes it more concrete how boundary work functions in an arts-based context and what some of the outcomes can be. So this is from a project that I did in collaboration with the Lake of the Woods Arts Collective in Northwestern Ontario, so based mostly out of Kenora. And at this time, there was divestment of forest tenure from a pulp and paper company that was given to the town of Kenora and the local First Nations. And so there's a lot of discussion around what common ground means and what it means to share a vision for the future of this land, and not just the parcel of land, but land in general in the area. And so this was also around the time of the release of the TRC calls to action. And so a lot of considerations about like what does this mean in the context of reconciliation? You know, how can we amplify the voices of people who are not often heard? And how can we also build relationships, create connections that don't exist? Because like many towns in Canada, many cities in Canada, the relationships are quite fraught between Indigenous and settler peoples, including Métis, within the Indigenous community. So the project was an arts project, as I mentioned, in collaboration with LOAC, Lake of the Woods Arts Collective. And we aimed to create connections and explore the meaning of shared land. It started with a focus group where people from the community were invited, so that it was advertised widely. And in this focus group, we discussed what shared land means. We mapped it out, workshopped it, and understood some themes, heard from a diversity of people, and then also decided on what a boundary object could be in this project, an arts-based boundary object. And it was decided that, that people wanted to work on something collective, but that they wanted to also leave opportunity for people to submit individually. So this project also resulted in a few individual submissions of art. But the main piece was a mosaic, a glass mosaic. So one of the artists in the collective has a glass studio and invited people to this space to learn about glass making, mosaic making, and also contribute to the building of the mosaic. But it wasn't only in this space that the mosaic was created. It was also taken to different libraries, public schools. So a number of youth participated in this. And yeah, really just a lot of different venues where people could feel comfortable and connected to this process. And so it engaged with over 90 participants, which really, I think, speaks to, you know, people's interests in exploring shared land through this kind of boundary object. And of course, while people are working together, they're talking, right? It's not just the production of the art that is the result, so to speak, but it's also the dialogue that happens around the boundary object while it's being created and as it lives on after it's made. So you can see here the final mosaic, which is now permanently set at the Lake of the Woods Discovery Center. And so it continues to have you know, visitors and discourse around what shared land is. And, you know, in each of these tiles, especially the turtle, there are messages and people have etched their perspective of shared land. There was also test tube installation. So you see those little test tubes in front of it. And so people wanted another way of expressing collectively. And so in the test tubes, you'd find poems, things collected from the land like feathers, rocks, seed beads. Seed beads are very, you know, used in cultural garments, and many other things that spoke to people's understanding of what shared land means. There was a public event at the museum, the Lake of the Woods Museum, where a number of people attended, were interviewed on camera. This was produced as a documentary. And so that's still available on Vimeo if you want to watch it and learn more about the process of making this artwork. It's about a half-hour video, and yeah, it provides quite a bit of detail, not just about the art, but about the place and the broader projects around it. So yeah, I mentioned other community outcomes, so relationship building and new connections, discovery and retaining a sense of place, and skill development. So in boundary work, it's often a nice idea if you can build in some kind of skill development for people participating. So in the boundary work approach, it's really trying to create outcomes during the research rather than just at the end, which is far more common. In research, we're often gleaning and then we make something at the end and then people either read it or they don't, or, it's a little bit vague sometimes for community members how their participation is going to turn into like meaningful outcomes for them. So in boundary work, we try and create experience or a product or something like that that is of value throughout the research process. So major considerations for the research. So some things to think about as you, endeavor into community engaged research and boundary work. So is your research aiming to address a particular problem? What boundary needs to be crossed or maintained? Who will the research be communicated to? Will it be within a community, among communities, with policymakers? So often boundary objects will need translation or interpretation, especially those that are arts-based. For example, this painting behind me or the mosaic, a person may walk up to it and say, wow, look at that, that's really beautiful, but have no clue as to like what the actual meanings are or what the intentions were behind creating it. And so interpretive materials along with certain boundary objects can be absolutely essential. Yeah. So how it fits within the participatory action research paradigm. So yeah, it fits with this liberatory paradigm, which aims to empower research participants. It seeks to co-construct knowledge, promote self and critical self-awareness that leads to individual, collective, and social change. So this is not just for participants, but for, university-based researchers or any type of researcher, could be with government. Building of alliances between research and participants in the planning, implementation, dissemination of the research. So all stages. So participants are co-researchers essentially. And yeah, so I mentioned the interpretation piece already. So communities also need to be engaged in this stage. So the interpretation shouldn't be just left to the researcher to interpret. The engagement remains throughout. And yeah, I mean, boundary objects can be very complex, multi-layered. They can just demonstrate many purposes and meanings. And so it's that relates to the co-creation and co-dissemination piece in understanding what those multiple meanings are. Yeah, so the process of creating a boundary object is often as important as the final product. And so that's something to just really keep in mind, and that is quite different in comparison to, the more classical approaches to research. So there are a number of ethical considerations. So participation, so same ethical considerations would apply to, other types of qualitative participatory approaches. So considerations regarding the population you're working with, informed consent, ongoing engagement and verification. Ownership is important to discuss at the outset of a project, especially if something, like an artwork or something physical is produced. So who owns what portions of the work following the completion of the project? So, just as an example, this painting that was produced through my work in Australia, I mean, I was a master's student at the time, so I didn't have all this sorted out. It was my first time doing boundary work. And so I just assumed that the community was going to keep the painting once it was done. But the community of artists said, no, we don't keep paintings here. That doesn't actually align with our practices and values. And we want you to take it and you need to share the message within it. while it's in your possession. So I continue to do that. That's my personal responsibility in the relationship. So it's important to value community protocols, respect community knowledge and culture, articulate concerns for the boundary work safekeeping, and facilitate place-based joint learning throughout the project. So ethical considerations are dependent on the project, the methods, and the participants in the community that are engaged through the research. And often communities have their own ethical guidelines that should be recognized. So in addition to, tri-council ethical guidelines, if there's, OCAP principles that are, First Nation OCAP principles that are to be followed. It's also important to, if you're working with Peguis First Nation, understand the ethical protocols of Peguis First Nation, for example. So this is from my website. So in building the website, I wanted to have kind of an approachable, boil it down to something that a community partner could come to the website and get a feeling for what boundary work is about. So this breaks it down into its stages with some visuals. So identifying the issue, the type of work in partnership, establishing ethical principles for working together, deciding on knowledge products, which are the boundary objects, determining ownership, and then how to share the knowledge products. So if you want to have a look at this, you can find this on the Community-Engaged CoLab.ca under approach. So this is a table just outlining the framework and the principles that I talked about today. This is a bit of a more straightforward version of it. In the paper with my colleagues that was published in Progress in Human Geography, we have a table that is parallel to this, but is a bit more detailed. And so you can see it outlines the stages that were in the visual depiction here with at the end, a need for evaluation and process feedback. And this creates, an iterative relationship, which is especially important when you continue to work with communities beyond just one project, which is the ideal with community engaged research, that, you're constantly building your relationship through different projects over time. But one-offs are okay too. I've had a lot of really great experiences with one-offs where people just need assistance with something in the moment. So I never discount those things because they can be really meaningful. So this is the paper that I mentioned in Progress in Human Geography. And this is what I often point my students to because it outlines it, in terms of what it's grounded on and theory, but also the tables and figures and things that can just be nice references and practical for understanding how to move through boundary work. Yeah, okay. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is melanie.zurba@dal.ca. Okay, thanks. Bye.